Okay, we're at time. So welcome to this presentation. We're going to be talking about documentation, something that's near and dear to my heart. I have the extreme honor and privilege to present alongside Olivier Jourdan and Kevan Anderson from WOVA Lab and Berkeley Labs, respectively. My name, if I haven't gotten a chance to meet you before, is Cilino. I just recently joined the DMC family. And if you've not heard of DMC, we do engineering consulting services around manufacturing automation. So think PLCs, all things test and measurement automation. So that's everything NI, embedded development, general application development spanning lots of languages, and digital workspace solutions. So think all things Microsoft. I'm also the president and founder of G Central. So like I said, I get the extreme opportunity to present next to these two gentlemen about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that is documentation. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so I'm a really big believer. Any sort of software undertaking that we start should always have some sort of a business objective behind it. So why do we do documentation? And I'm big about resolving it to time and money. If you can't resolve the software development that you're doing to time and money, I question as to whether or not it should be done. So I'm going to suggest that doing documentation does resolve to saving time and money. Specifically, saves developers time when somebody is trying to use your work so that they don't have to reverse engineer your work. It saves your end user time, somebody who's trying to decipher your GUI so they don't have to push the magic button to figure out how to do what needs to be done. And then it saves you as the developer's time in figuring out, do I have to recreate a thing, or is there a thing out there that already exists that I can use? So all of that ultimately boils down to time and money. Okay, documentation. When we say documentation, what exactly do we mean? Well, I'd like to submit the following definition broadly. So I'm going to suggest that documentation is a representation or representation of code or GUIs that's designed to abstract, hide unnecessary details for humans attempting to quickly evaluate and or use your work. So you've got this graphic on the left-hand side of the screen, lots of code, or a big GUI. We're going to smash it down into a document that's easily parsable by humans so they can get to the value of what you're trying to present without having to reverse engineer your code. Okay, cool. Who are these humans? Okay, because oftentimes you need to keep your audience in mind. So documentation, for whom? There's lots of different audiences. In this presentation, we're going to talk about 3 different audiences, and 2 of them have significant overlap. So the first audience is for those programmers attempting to use API VIs. The second one is for programmers who are attempting to use APIs, plus understand how messages are sent in message-based frameworks. And then the last audience we're going to talk about is end users attempting to use your GUIs. So we want documentation tailored to each of those individuals. Okay, great. So we've got the who, we've got the why, we're going to save time and money. So we're all doing documentation because it makes sense, right? Well, no. If documentation saves time and money, why don't we do it? There's lots of reasons why. I'm going to suggest the following 3. 1, look, documentation is hard. As developers, we spend the vast majority of our time thinking about how to represent concepts in code. If we then have to go through the additional effort of representing concepts in summarized document, I don't want to do that. It's hard. I get it. Secondly, and maybe the biggest of all, documentation is oftentimes unappreciated during development. And rarely are we going to go back after the fact and do documentation. Okay, it's just the way the world works. And then lastly, and this is probably the biggest one, documentation quickly goes stale, and it's horrific to try and keep the documentation in sync with the code. Now, I'm going to suggest that stale documentation is worse than no documentation at all. So we want to try and solve that problem. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the rest of this presentation. How do we keep documentation fresh so that it is an accurate representation of code or GUIs? All right, I'm going to lead us off. I'm going to pass this over to Olivier and then Kevan. So I'm going to present to you what I call the LabVIEW auto documentation utility. Now, before we go anywhere, pull out your phones, take a screenshot. This is everything that you need to know. If you hear nothing else, this is what you want. So where can you get the auto documentation utility? There's a bit.ly to the example. Then I have a Bitbucket that is all of the code. It's MIT, it's open source, you can clone it down. And also I export the LabVIEW auto documentation utility as both a VI package and an NI package. So you can install it as you see fit. And then lastly, there's one of my presentations I gave at a LabVIEW architect meeting a couple of years ago is everything that I'm about to talk through. It's a little bit old, but it's still true in spirit. So that's where you can find all this stuff. Who is this for? For programmers who need an in-depth project summary of APIs only. So I'm not necessarily talking about how your actors are messaging or how your DQMH messages are getting sent to whom. I'm looking at the API VIs themselves. And what I'm going to document are LV classes, LV libs, and the LV proj. And that document is viewable in Bitbucket wikis, and it's likely also viewable in GitHub and GitLab wikis. I just haven't tested it yet. Confluence pages, if you're unfamiliar with Confluence, Confluence is awesome. And then as Jira issues. And I'm going to specifically look at Confluence pages in this presentation. But if you want to actually see a Bitbucket representation, that's that top link, the wiki example. So you can go there now and see, well, what does this printout documentation look like? And again, this is going to be the 10,000, 20,000 foot view for the in-depth treatment. You'll find the auto documentation presentation at that link. Okay, so we're going to start off by taking a look at a report of an LV class, specifically printed to or viewable through Confluence. Okay, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see three different items: charter, private data, member information. We're going to go through each one of those, and we're going to start off with the charter. It's what you would expect. The charter is a one, maybe two sentence description about the class pulled from the class documentation, and poof, there it appears, the top of the report. No big deal. The private data. This is where things get really rich really quickly. And there's a lot inside of this table. So what I'm going to do is break each of these columns into their own separate section. So the name of the private data is pulled directly from the CTL of your class. So if you have a private data member named authentication, it's going to show up in this list. But more than just the name of the private data member, I'm also going to give some indication of the data structure of that private data. Maybe your private data member is an array. Maybe it's a cluster. Maybe it's a reference like a DVR or a VI refnum. You're going to see annotations that are very closely parallel the JSON structure next to the private data member name, like authentication squirrely brackets. That's a cluster. If there is an element inside of that cluster, squirrely brackets period gets you the next element inside of that cluster. So authentication has username and password. And you can imagine this structure can get as deep and as rich as all the data structures inside of LabVIEW allow for. Period is the what's contained in. So a star is the value being referenced. Squirrely bracket star is the element of a cluster. Square brackets period, sorry, is the element of an. How about now?
Fine. You can.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And in that 30 seconds, you just lost tons of information. I'm just kidding. Okay, so now we're in that middle section, the description of the elements in the CTL. That's sourced directly from the description and tip, so you can right-click on each element inside of your class's private data and add a description and tip, and then poof, it shows up in the middle column. Okay, now we move over to the right-hand side. And this is where we describe the actual data type of the element inside of your cluster. So all the standard data types are supported. If you have a cluster, it shows up as cluster. If you have a string, a Boolean, whatever, an array. But I also do a little bit of special magic for some special data types. Like for a type def, I'm going to say type def of the name and its data type. For enums, I'm going to say it's enum of, let's say, U16. And then I'm going to actually list all of the enumerations inside of that enum. So you see at a glance what's all inside of this enumeration. For a class, I'm going to say LabVIEW class of type blah, 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 whatever. Now, here's what gets really cool inside of Confluence. If that class is documented somewhere else, I'm going to link directly from where you see the hyperlink here where it says REST client. You'd be able to link directly to the other class's information. And I'm a strong believer in linking all the documentation so that it's easy for you to navigate and find what you need. And the last thing is rings, and it's similar to enums. Okay, pressing on. So that was the private data of a class. Now I present the member information of a class. We've got the name, the scope. Is it dynamic dispatch? Is it must override, must use parent implementation, the description, and then the prototype. And inside of the must override and must use parents implementation, I even let you specify why. Because oftentimes we'll say, I'm going to make this thing must override, and you've got a good reason for that. So you can list it for both the must override and must use parents implementation. And I can't go into the details of how now because I only have 9 minutes left. All right, but something else I found really handy about this printout is that prototype column. It allows me to audit my API and see, am I presenting a coherent API to my user? Let's look at all the inputs and all the outputs, and does it just make sense? Also, did I make the required inputs required, et cetera? Do I have a unique icon? All right, so there's that. That's the class. Now we're going to jump into the LV-lib. And this is, again, printed to Confluence, but it's very similar inside of Bitbucket, which if you want to, you can walk through that example like I said at the beginning of the presentation. There's, again, on the left-hand side, these are all of the elements of a report. We have the charter of the class, and again, that's a 1 or 2 sentence description at most pulled from the LV-lib's documentation itself. So you're documenting inside the IDE. We're not doing anything extra. And then I'm pulling directly from the IDE into these reports. The library is going to list any of the libraries it contains, as well as any classes that it contains. And we're going to have the class's name, the description, and the location's not terribly useful. I'm working on that. But under the name, those are all hyperlinks. So you can then get to the class's particular documentation. If there are any members, so just VIs that are, or CTLs that are floating around, they're going to show up here as well as in the controls. All right, that's the libraries report. Lastly, we have the project. And the project is the easiest of all because I'm not actually presenting anything new. It has the charter, the libraries inside of it, the classes, the members, and the controls. And I've thought about including things like the diagram disable symbols. I think that's what they're called. It's a little bit tricky. Things I'd like to add are, what are the targets? What are the build specs? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that's what's in it. That's what you get when you make a printout. Well, how do you make a printout? Right? Is it an application? Is it how's this functionality exposed to you as the user? I've done it through an API, and I've tried to make the API as absolutely straightforward as I possibly can. There's 3 main functions for creating a report: construct, generate, close. So for a project, that means you specify the path to the project and any virtual folders you'd like to exclude from documentation. This comes in handy if you don't want to print out documentation for all your accessors, or if you only want your public APIs, then you can exclude everything besides the public API section. So this is how this is the functionality that goes to your source code and grabs all of the information. And now it lives in memory while we're generating a report. And that's nice, but I need to take that information and shove it into Confluence or Bitbucket. So how do I do that? Well, you call print. So you construct, you generate the report, and then you print it out. And PS, there's an API like this for projects, LV-libs, and classes. So if you just have a class floating around on disk, you use the classes API instead of the projects API. All right, so in the print, you'll see that I pass in an array of printers. Well, what's a printer? It's like a Bitbucket. And there's a function called construct Bitbucket wiki markdown. So all that takes in is the the wiki location, the clone down wiki location of your Bitbucket wiki. And that's the way that Bitbucket works. Their wiki is just like any other repository. You clone it down and you can make edits to it. It's just a bunch of markdown files. So that's the directory that is the cloned down location of the Bitbucket wiki. Pass that in and you're done. All right. Well, what if I want to print out to Bitbucket and Confluence? Well, that's an array of printers. So all we need to do is construct the Confluence printer object. And this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So Confluence takes in the base URL. This is where your Confluence thing is out in the world, your username and password, the parent page that you want all this new documentation to live under, and then any sort of commit comments, any sort of labels. So you specify all that, construct the Confluence printer, add it to the array, you're off to the races. And the chances of you all remembering all of this, it's not going to happen. And I get that. That's the reason why I put together a number of examples. And these examples, if you clone down the project, you're going to see under the examples directory, how do you generate a project report? And it's just this API, and I expose it through UI. And if you install via VI package or NI package, you're going to see on disk where these examples live. Okay. I also have inside of the Bitbuckets wiki explanations of those GUIs. Okay, couple of caveats, big warnings, not warnings, but just things that you need to be aware of. Whenever a printout does occur, I'm going to edit your source. So what that means is that wherever the location was, wherever this documentation lives, the class, the LVLib, the LV project knows where its documentation lives. And I did that intentionally so that you can call update versus printing out a brand new Confluence page. I don't want a new Confluence page. I already got one. I just want to update that Confluence page's content with a reprint out so that that page can get linked against throughout the rest of your Confluence, or the same thing for your Bitbucket. The other thing I tried to do, I tried to be smart and let you make edits to that programmatically generated page in Confluence, and then I try and dance around your edits. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. That's why at the top of every Confluence page, I say, hey, warning, this page was programmatically generated. Any custom edits you make to this page might be overwritten. But the cool thing is, once you print out your stuff, you don't ever need to specify the destination again. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to actually go to the class and ask, where does your documentation live? And I'm going to use that source. For Confluence, I try and update the already existing documentation. For Bitbucket, I didn't even bother. I'm just like, rewrite the whole thing. So I'm going to blap whatever custom audits or edits you made to that markdown file.
Chris?
Okay. Yes.
There's one question in the chat. Does this report only output to Confluence, or will this print out a Markdown or more general wiki format?
That's great. So it prints out to Markdown. Bitbucket uses Markdown. Bitbucket has its own flavor of Markdown. It's easily, sorry, that flavor of Markdown I think is easily extendable to GitLab and GitHub. I just haven't tested it yet, but we print to Markdown. So anything that can use Markdown, ta-da, can use this. I need to make printers for GitLab and GitHub specifically, but I don't think it's going to be that hard. That's some future work that I'd like to do, actually as soon as possible, as well as printing to HTML, PDF, Word documents, you name it. And oh man, I could talk about this for a long time, and I have 40 seconds left, so I'm not gonna. All right. In summary, this is there's a wiki example where you can see a Bitbucket printout. There it is. That's the LV Autodoc example. There's the Bitbucket that contains all of the source and how it's organized. You even have a UML diagram. And then last, if you want to see a much more in-depth presentation on how the code is structured and how to use it, it's a little bit old, you can go into my presentations. And that is all I have in 19 minutes and 51 seconds. You're welcome. Okay, so now I'm going to shut up and turn this over to Olivier. I hope I did that right.
Looks like it.
Okay.
Up. Can you see my screen? Hear me? Okay. So thank you, Chris. So I just want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm Olivier Jourdan. I'm LabVIEW champion, LabVIEW architect. I created my own company, Lab 2 years ago. And if you want to know more about me, just reach out to me on LinkedIn or on my website. So today's presentation is about Antidoc. And Antidoc is a project I've been working on for more than 1 year now. And I divided my presentation in 4 main parts. First, Antidoc goals. Second, what you can currently get with Antidoc. Third, what's under the hood. And fourth, next steps to come. So what was the Antidoc goals? Generate LabVIEW source code documentation automatically. You are not really surprised of that. We wanted also to take the best out of available info in LabVIEW. So there are explicit information like project descriptions, class, LVlib, and VI description, but also implicit information. So how the different parts of your code are working together, for example. And we also want to obtain a document in a standard file format of your choice, like HTML or PDF, to fit with your tools you are used to using. For the first version of Antidoc, the goals were to validate the documentation generation workflow. We would like to be sure that it was easy to obtain the final document. And secondly, we want to validate the capability to get valuable documentation. So what you can get with Antidoc v11, this is the latest version available on VIPM. Before showing you the final result of documentation, I want to introduce and to say what I meant by valuable documentation. For me, this is not just a list of VI description, but also something that helps you to understand how the code is working. And for that, we need to analyze the code components. In the first version, as far as I'm DQMatch Trusted Advisor, and I use DQMatch for 99% of my project, I worked on the parsing of DQMatch framework. So currently, Antidoc only works with DQMatch framework component for the parsing, but we are going to work on other framework. So how it works? The basic way to obtain a documentation, it's first to install Antidoc with VIPM, and then you can find the tool into the LabVIEW tool menu, and you get the UI you can see on the right of the screen. You just need to select the LV proj you want to document, add a title to your document, add an author name and an email. This is optional to fill in, but and then you are just hitting the generate documentation button. Once it's done, you can open the generated file with your browser, with Chrome, for example, with the extension named ASCII-Doctor.js Live Preview. And here is what you can obtain. And this is the default preview of your document. So you can see a document with a table of content to navigate through the document. And you have graphs, table, different representation. You can click on the different cross-reference, internal cross-reference in the document, and see the list of the public VI in LabVIEW or an ADQMH module. And if we look at the implicit information you can get with the with Antidoc, you can see in the modules overview. So this is the DQMH modules, the list of the modules, if they are singleton or clonable, and a graph that represents the interaction between all the modules. So this is a big picture of the interaction of the different modules in your application. So you can see that CML UI request acquisition module. You can see that the logger is listening for broadcast information from settings editor. And if you want more information on the module, you can click the link and see the purpose of the module. This is something we get from the LabVIEW description. And who is starting the module, who stopped the module, and we have a more accurate graph of the relationship between this specific module with the other part of the code. And we have 4 tables that list the request used by the rest of the code, the listener of the broadcast of this module, and for this module, which requests are used by this module and which broadcasts are listened by this module. So with these 4 tables and this graph, you have everything about your module interaction. For me, this is really valuable information, and you can use this documentation to onboard new member in your team because you can show him a graph with all the interaction between your different components of your code. And you can also lead design reviews. I actually find some bugs in some of my projects just looking at the graph of the documentation provided by Antidoc. And as Chris said earlier, we need to have documentation up to date. So Antidoc can be used with your continuous integration process. And you can easily render the final document through a specific CI job. It's really easy with GitLab, for example, and I think it's easy with other tools. And you can glance at an example project here if you want. We also talk about output format. So I showed you an HTML report that was a default HTML report. We can also get a PDF or EPUB or DocBook. For me, HTML and PDF are the best format you can use, and it's also really useful to be customizable format. So HTML5 can be customized using CSS files, and you can also customize PDF. And I will show you the same report showed earlier, but in a PDF format with a customization. So I can get here a title page, a table of content that works the same way than the HTML report. And on each page, you can see a header with the company logo and a footer with what you want to add in it. So this, for me, is validating the first goals of Antidoc. So how it works, what's under the hood for Antidoc? The challenges was to find a way to offer multiple output file formats. But we also want to concentrate development effort on documentation content, not on generating the different file formats. So the solution was to write a simple plain text file using a markup format, and this markup format is ASCII docs syntax. And ASCII docs comes with ASCII Doctor toolchain that allow you to convert ASCII doc file to the final format. If we look at the picture of how things are working, you can trigger generation of documentation by the UI in LabVIEW or by the command line. Antidoc is passing the document and it's generating an ad hoc file that is going to be treated in two different ways. You can use the web browser with the extension and get an HTML preview, or you can use the toolchain to get the full possibility of format, HTML, PDF, etc. So we are really working on the parsing and retrieving the content in the project, not in generating the HTML file. Antidoc rely on open source projects. ASCII Doctor is an open source project, and we use 3 different LabVIEW open source projects to ASCII Doc Toolkit for LabVIEW to generate the output, Graph Builder to generate the files, the graph, excuse me, and GCLI to use Antidoc in your continuous integration tools. So Antidoc is obviously also an open source project, so you can help Antidoc project by reporting issues, sharing feature ideas, contributing to the code or to the documentation of Antidoc. And I'd like to take the opportunity of this presentation to give a special thanks to all the actual Antidoc contributors. So thank you guys and girls for your time and for your help. And now I think I have less than 2 minutes. Next steps to come. We are working on integrating UML class diagram. So we want to do the same thing we are doing with DQMH, but with your classes, and get this kind of representation in Antidoc. We also want to work on supporting other framework like Actor framework or GK State Machine Object or any public framework that can be useful to support. And we have more and more ideas to improve Antidoc on this thing. Just reach out to us on GitLab if you have some idea to add in Antidoc. I put here some resources if you want to know more about Antidoc, and I think it's all for my presentation. Just 15 minutes, and I will let Kevan present his tool. Thank you for your time and for listening to me.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Kevin Anderson. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully, I think Chris, or Olivier, you're still sharing, so I don't think my screen is popped up as.
Yes. Let's go.
All right. All right. So yeah, if you look at the screen here, you might assume that yes, I'm coming to you from California, and no, the sun has not risen yet. But I wanted to join you guys here and present the concept that I call a manual generator, very generic name. A little introduction about myself. I'm the Beamline Controls Lead at Berkeley Lab. And in that position, well, I guess I'll get that into the introduction on the next slide. But what is a manual generator? Basically, this is something that I've been developing that will create an HTML-based manual, and it will use the VI interface to help you do that as well. these guys have already covered a lot of the basics of what you want a generator, a manual generator to do, but I think it's important to say that this thing also integrates with continuous integration. My motivation is a little different than the previous speakers, and I wanted to highlight that because I think some of you who are watching this may also have a similar situation. Berkeley Labs and the Advanced Light Source where I work, we're a user facility, so we have people coming in to do basic science all the time. And over the years, there have been about 5 developers working on a code base and creating custom user interfaces for these guys for about 15 years. And there's just a ton of screens that these scientists are using. And these screens are scattered all over our facility. And we have about 2,000 users who come in every year. And some of these users are expert users, but a lot of them are coming and seeing our software for the first time. And currently, we have 0 manuals. And that's something that, as a new employee here, I wanted to change. So that's sort of the motivation. I wanted something that's going to make it easy for my team to create a manual that documents the user interface, that's going to be up to date, that you're not going to have to write things twice. You're not going to have to write it in the tooltip editor as well as go a Word document somebody else. So that's really the motivation of what I'm sharing today. And I really, I don't have an open source project. I don't have something on the VI package manager, but I haven't been working on this project for as long as some of the other presenters. And so I kind of want to show you guys what's possible to get going for your project. And I'm happy to talk about ideas if people wanted to contact me. So, some of the workflows that are important for this, at least this is the top one, is my developer workflow. We don't finish off projects within our team until we move through the documentation step. So this is a little bit of a manual review, but after we've tested our code, we move to the documentation phase, and then part of moving that tag in our workflow is moving it over to done, is checking the documentation and making sure something was created. But the idea here is to have the continuous integration workflow, build that manual on a periodic basis, notify developers if there's problems. So there's feedback from the manual saying, okay, something got screwed up in the manual, go back and fix it. So there's actually some inspection in the build process, and then publishing that manual and making sure that all of my users can get to it. So these are some of the things that we're trying to address. I really wanted the users to have the tooltips. I mean, if all the tooltips are filled out, things are a lot easier for somebody who's just using that tool for the first time. I wanted them to have access to the quick help. So if they hit Control-H, maybe they're a slightly savvy LabVIEW user, they can hit Control-H and get some help. And I wanted the documentation to link to something. So if they had a little link at the bottom of that quick help, I wanted it to go somewhere as well. So I created a tool. And I'll start from the beginning on this tool and kind of walk you through a workflow here, but I think it's going to be helpful in terms of understanding what my direction is and where I was going. It opens a file much like you would open a file in Word or something like that. So you can start a new manual, or you can open an existing one, and you do that through the file menu. One of the important things about this file that you're actually opening is that it can be merged in your version control. So this file that you create, it should live with your code. It's a text file. It's kind of a little database, but it should live with your code. And that way, when 2 developers are working on it, it can get merged together. So one of the first things you do in sort of the workflow that I was imagining here is you define a structure to your manual. So you're actually writing a real text manual that you're going to present as a document and say, hey, here's how to use my software. And to do that, you need a little bit of structure. So I came up with the concept of main groups and subgroups, and then you're going to add pages within that. And this page here, or this little tab here, allows you to sort of later reconfigure which group your particular page is in. So if you realize that, oh, I grouped it wrong, I need to move this page over and talk about it in this section, you can do that. Also, I think it's important visually, right? I don't like to document things if I can't look at what I'm doing, especially if I don't remember. And so I really wanted to have something visual that was presented. So I've got a little preview here of the thing that I'm going to be documenting. And I can give it a different title other than the VI name. I thought that was important too, because the VI name may be very long, but the title should be descriptive to the person reading the manual. Then I wanted to create an editor that you can edit all of the documentation on the VI. I don't know if you guys enjoy using the Control-I and then clicking down and getting to the document tab within LabVIEW. I've seen other tools where they expose that and just got rid of that, and you can get all of that in code. So what I did is I created a user interface that just sort of exposes all that. So you can type in the description, and this will actually edit the description of your VI. Other things that you can do, I've got links, so you can link pages together. This is a manual process, and I'll show you how this kind of fits together, but you're writing a manual. This is not something where the manual gets written for you. You're writing a manual, but you're doing it in the code, and then you're using another tool to create a human presentable interface or something that somebody else can read. So then not only do you want to edit the description of the VI, because that'll come up as, if you hit Control H. I also wanted to get the tooltips and the description of the tools. So I have pulled out pictures of all of the controls that are on that VI that you've selected, and I've put them in an array here, and you can come down here and just tab through and write in the tooltip, write in the description. Whatever you write for the tooltip, as soon as you hit tab, it automatically gets copied to the description, and you can edit it from there. And there's going to be things on your front panel that you don't want to document. So got a nice little checkbox here that you can check something and say, hey, I don't document this. Nobody needs to see this. This is hidden. Everything that I can that goes with the VI, I'm saving in the VI. But there's some things like don't include this control or whatnot. Those are all going into the file. So there's sort of this duality. There's a manual file, and then there's that sort of lists all the VIs that you want to present, and then there's the VIs themselves that have the code. And that way the tooltip lives in the VI, and you've documented it once. So what does it take to build the manual? You just come up here to File, Make HTML Manual. I wasn't, doing too much crazy stuff here. And that's going to generate this document here called Presentation Manual. And you can pick the name of what you want this thing to be called, but it's just an HTML document. And what's interesting is this is actually just something that reads a JSON format. So I'm using a JavaScript to parse out JSON and then sort of spool it out into an HTML page. But I just thought it was really easy to get LabVIEW to spit out stuff in the JSON format, because I can just take a structure and pump it out, and I didn't have to do a lot of work. So all of the content in terms of what's where when it does that processing of all your VIs, all of the description and tips, it comes out in this .js. And handy, there's also your own CSS file. So I am not the greatest formatter. I didn't put in bells and whistles to my CSS. I just created something really basic, and you'll see that basic thing now. So, but you could edit this as much as you want. So this is the kind of output you get. It's going to give you a table of contents with links. It's going to do it all in a single file because I wanted to be able to print it to PDF. Some of these other guys have shown tools with the ASCII doc that looks like it goes to multiple formats. I think that would be something that could be an improvement here. But HTML was something I knew, so I did it really quick. And this is what a page looks like. So it's going to put that front panel that you saw of your user interface, but it's also going to pull out the pictures of all the controls and put the tooltips in. And if you don't like the look of this, or it's a little programmer bland, you could update your CSS. The last thing is publishing. So I wanted to make sure that you could publish out. Once you created this HTML manual, you could hit a button and it would go and it would force the URLs for each of those VIs into the VIs themselves. So you could put the base URL here, and then you hit go, and it'll go through all your VIs and push all of that stuff out. And so I think that's probably it there. One of the things that you see here is this calculate stats, but I'll show that in the bells and whistles. So these are the bells and whistles that I put in, and I thought they were kind of cool. And this is getting to the end here. But these are the things I added. I'm like, these are going to make it a little bit better. I wanted to be able to put a text file into my manual as well, something that I wrote but I also wanted to be able to put that text file into my code. So if you create a text file and drop it in your code base somewhere and somebody's editing their code, that text file is going to be closer than them having to search somewhere else. And then that text file can also be sucked into your manual. So I actually made this presentation page and then zoomed it up as an actual page in my manual, and I typed it in a text file using HTML. There is a concept of complete. So if you've completed a page, it knows that you completed the page. You've gotten all the everything documented within that page. And also it'll go back and they'll compile the stats for your whole manual. And it'll say, hey, 3 pages were in this manual and these pages were complete but aren't anymore. And that's how you're gonna send notices to developers if they've screwed up. I talked about it already. The file is a mini database with all of the links, so you can change names and whatnot. I'll finish off with what sort of is the future work and where else does this need to go. I think the user interface could be better. One of my coworkers made a better user interface in a week, and it didn't work out because he didn't have any of the back end going behind it. But also, I don't treat tabs very well. I think I already saw this in the comments. Somebody asked, how do I handle tabs? I don't handle tabs right now, and I need to. My CSS could be improved. And, you know, I created this tool and I wanted to share it to sort of jumpstart a conversation about an area that I don't think people are talking about in terms of LabVIEW documentation. But at the same time, it wasn't that hard to get to where I got if you've got an idea and wanted to customize it. I mean, I think I got my tool up and working in less than a month. So that's I don't know if where that falls on your investment for documentation, but I think getting something that makes documentation easier is worth that month to get you something that really does what you like. So I'll finish off. I've put my email address here. My code is not open source yet. It could be. I have to do some paperwork and work through a bureaucracy at the laboratory to get this open source, but I'd be happy to do that if someone was really interested in my tool. So I wanted to present it and share sort of the idea of that. So I think that's it. Were there any other comments that I missed in the question mark, guys, or in the chat? All right, I think that's it for me. Did we get to the end of this presentation, or do we have a opportunity to open it up to questions for everybody?